Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Barbara Hammond.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Brief recap from last time, because we finished last time with the book of Genesis, and the stories of the patriarchs, with their stories sitting comfortably into the second millennium before Christ. And it ended with the story of Joseph. That story finished with the migration of Jacob's family to Egypt during a time of famine, where they were welcomed by the Pharaoh of the time. And they settled near the new capital city, Avaris, in the marshy delta area of the River Nile called Goshen. I've lost my picture. There we are. The plan of Egypt, as the River Nile goes northwards into the Mediterranean Sea, with that very striking green area of fertile mud. And on the right-hand side of your picture, or I should say the eastern end of it, right on that tip is where it joins the Sinai desert and the corner round to Canaan. And just below that, only a few miles south of that, is the city of Avaris. Avaris was built, so we're told, at this time, and nobody knew where it was because it's long since disappeared. In the days when geophys studies were beginning to help archaeologists, I saw a program on television which the whole of the Nile River Valley was geophysed by archaeologists with their machinery from the air. And they found all sorts of interesting places to investigate in future. And one of them was the delta area. They had to prove their point because this was a very new style of study. And eventually they were given permission to dig on one of these sites they thought they discovered. And the program ended with the discovery of the ruins of the city of Avaris in the Nile Delta. So it really was there. So and this whole area, which looks like green on the map, was very grassy, very marshy, and was called Goshen. But next slide shows the pyramids. And they had been there for 500 years before the Israelites even went to Egypt, because they were built much the same time as Abraham had lived. So we're definitely now in Egypt. Historically, scholars seem to agree that the migration with Jacob and Joseph was probably during the years of the 15th dynasty, when Egypt was under foreign rule. And the foreigners were called the Hyksos, probably the Hittites. Do you remember the Hittites from Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, who at that time ruled all of Canaan down the Mediterranean coast and were expanding their influence with the help of new technology, like this. Very speedy, lightweight, horse-drawn chariots. They could move fast and quickly, and they did. A new technology always beats the old. Anyway, the Hyksos came to rule in the country called Egypt. And it was they who built the city of Avaris as their capital, right in that corner of the Nile Delta, which was nearest to their home stretch on the Canaan and into Turkey. Now, that family ruled for about 150 years before being thrown out by another Egyptian family of pharaohs. Soon after, in the next dynasty, the descendants of Jacob began to be, persona non grata. and were gradually reduced to the level of conscript workers and put to work. We tend to think of them as slaves, but in actual fact, they were conscript workers forced to work for the pharaoh. Many years further on, during the 18th dynasty, during the 18th industry, avarice was destroyed and the Egyptian power was again on the rise, only to be diminished again by the Hittites. The next slide. Is a picture from the pyramids, from the tombs of Egypt, where the walls are covered with paintings, and that shows you a typical group of conscript workers working for Pharaoh. The animals they need to carry the stuff they need, the boat to take away what they've made. Can you see in the top level, the one dressed all in white? Now he would have been the overseer in charge of all the work that was going on. And so we go on as well. So the Hittites went, and later on they tried to come back, as we know from the diplomatic correspondence found in the Tel El-Amarna archives. But finally, during the exuberant era of the 19th dynasty, the reigns of Seti I and his son Rameses II saw Egypt reach the peak of the culture for which it is still so famous. Religiously, as in the Fertile Crescent, there were many gods worshipped in Egypt, but with a difference. Whereas in Mesopotamia, all the gods were visualized as meeting in a sort of heavenly council under the great god El. El was a great umbrella, like over all the others, or chairman of the council. And the kings of Mesopotamia acted out the stories of their gods at the New Year festivals. The Egyptians, though, believed that all their gods had given supreme authority to the pharaoh to rule on their behalf as if he were a god. And he acted out their stories at various festivals in Egypt every year. Now, this difference made the pharaoh very powerful, and it created the stability which enabled their civilization to last as long as it did, right up to the time of Cleopatra. Sadly, for our purpose, there is no mention at all in any of the vast Egyptian records of Moses or of any escaping slave workers. Scholars, however, are mainly agreed that it was possibly during the reign of Seti I in the 13th century BC that a royal princess found a baby hidden among the rushes in the river Nile. And so now we must start our story from the beginning. The book of Exodus is sometimes called the foundation of the Jewish religion. And its story begins in Egypt, many years after the time of Joseph. But the tone is very different. Chapter 1 sets the scene. There was a new enthusiasm for building. But remember, avarice was built on the Nile Delta. Another city was built there as well, called Pithom. But there was no building stone in that area. It was all marshy clay. So construction in the Delta region was only possible with clay bricks held together with straw and then dried in the hot sunshine. The times were prosperous, and there were many conscript brickmakers available. But eventually the numbers of conscripts rose to this extent that it caused alarm among the overseers, who began to feel rather vulnerable. Attempts were made to curb this when the Hebrew midwives were commanded to kill all the baby boys. But it didn't work. The midwives took no notice and got away with it. And the next idea failed to be effective as well. Moses arrives into the story at the beginning of chapter 2. He is introduced as a member of the important tribe of Levi. Levi's tribe was important for two very important reasons. First, because from Moses, at the bottom of the slide, we have the whole tradition of the prophets of the Old Testament, finishing with the Pharisees in the New Testament. And the Pharisees even survived the events of 70 AD, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the state of Israel came to an end. But secondly, the whole line of Jewish priests came from the tribe of Levi, from Aaron, Moses' older brother. And their tradition went all the way through the Old Testament, into the temples, and by the time we get to the New Testament, they become the Sadducees. And they lasted till 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, and most of them were killed as well. So it was the Pharisees who survived. Well, the two boys had a sister, and she came between the two of them, and her name was Miriam. The story of the baby Moses, hidden in the bulrushes and found and adopted by the princess, is one of the most delightful in the whole Bible. And I wish it were true. But listen. Listen to a translation of the ancient cuneiform tablet of Sargon the Great. That's taking us back to the beginning, isn't it? Do you remember Sargon the Great lived 500 years before Abraham? His daughter, Princess Hedjuana, became his regent and high priestess at the city of Ur. Well, we go back to his time. We come to a tablet. A clay tablet written in ancient cuneiform. And this is called the Legend of Sargon the Great. And it was found in the city of Nineveh, which was excavated in 1867, in the Royal Library, the library of King Ashurbanipal. I'm going to read you a translation of the first part of it. I, King of Akkad, am I. My changeling mother conceived me. In secret, she bore me. She set me in a basket of rushes, and with bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which would have been the Euphrates, which rose not over me. The river bore me up to Eqypt, the drawer of water. Eqypt, the drawer of water, lifted me out as he dipped his ewer. Eqypt, the drawer of water, took me as his son and reared me. Eqypt, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. And while I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love. Now, Ishtar was goddess, later known as Astarte, and, has a long history. So what are we to make of this? Don't fear. This story is as important for the story of Moses as it was for Sargon. It's a birth story, one of many in the ancient world to prepare the listener to pay careful attention to what comes next, because it will be the story of someone who's very, very important. Many such ancient people have birth stories attached to their name, and quote just a few: Achilles, Alexander the Great, the Buddha, Romulus and Remus, Samuel, and dare I suggest, Jesus? But don't worry, we'll come to that in due course. Back to Moses. His birth story recounts his humble origins and separation from his mother, abandoned, but having a miraculous rescue and education until he came under the influence of a god. And remember, the Pharaoh was believed to be the embodiment of all the Egyptian gods. And at that point, the storytellers adopted the story to serve their own purposes. They add the intervention of Miriam, who offered the Egyptian princess a wet nurse for the tiny baby, thereby giving Moses those early formative years with his mother, who no doubt taught him of his family ancestors from Abraham onwards. When he was older, his mother presented him to the princess, who adopted him into the regime of a prince of Egypt. He would have heard no more about the Abraham and his God, but he would have learned all about the Egyptian pantheon. He would have taken part in all their religious ceremonies with all his fellow pupils. Many people, including the French scholar Christian Jacques, think he was educated along with Seti's favourite son, the future Pharaoh Rameses II. And if so, he would have spoken the Egyptian language, he would have worn fine Egyptian clothes in pleated white cotton, which is top quality, just as it is today, and he would have sported an Egyptian hairstyle. He would have learned to read and write, hieroglyphics, remember, in Egypt. He would have studied science and maths, astronomy, and all the laws of Egypt, not to mention all the martial arts of the day. He would also have learnt the niceties of etiquette in the royal palaces. And more than even in these, he would have been trained to be a good leader. And all these assets, of course, would have a vital importance for what was to come. Then one day, it all came tumbling down when he happened to witness one of his own people being beaten by the Egyptian in charge of them. After a quick look round, he killed the overseer and hurriedly buried his body in the sand. But the next day he realised he'd not earned any gratitude from his people. When he tried to resolve a quarrel among them, he realised that even them were already gossiping about him, and that he was now in danger of his life, according to the Egyptian law, and he fled, just as he was. No luggage, no food, no water, ran out of Egypt by the quickest route and into the Sinai desert, an area called Midian. Not very inviting, was it? Such an Egyptian, alone in the desert, would hardly have survived the unsheltered heat of the sun. Moses was like a fish, totally out of water. His beautiful clothes were completely useless, and there were no servants, as at the palace, hurrying him to bring him the next meal. or even another cup of refreshing cool wine. He didn't die, however. He was saved by a family of girls whom he helped when they came to water their flocks at a well in the cool of the evening. Here we have a picture of a small oasis in the hills. Their father, thinking it was an Egyptian who'd helped them, invited him into the compound. Their father was an important man in the area, a priest of the god of Midian, whom they believed lived on a very tall, holy mountain in the area. And in these stories, as we heard last week, two differing traditions of stories have been combined together. Do you remember the J and the E? And the J, I told you, was the southern group of stories, and I remembered it with the name of J for Jerusalem. Well, we have two stories woven together here. They're the same in outline, but different in detail. So the priest is known both as Jethro and Ruel. Same man, two names. And the mountain also has two names, Sinai and Horeb. Well, Moses had to learn a lot very quickly. How to speak their language for a start, and how to live far from civilization, how to observe their customs of the desert, and how to learn one end of a sheep from the other. With no further future ahead of him, he settled down. He eventually married the oldest of Jethro's daughters. As time went by, he began to take charge of Jethro's herds, always ready to move them to new pastures when necessary. And our story continues on one such journey. He came to the foothills around the holy mountain. I've left it in black and white. I hope it's beginning to cause a shiver. He came to the foothills around the holy mountain. And while he began to climb, he had one of those special religious moments. Do you remember the word I gave you? A theophany, which can only be described in picture language. He saw fire on the mountain. Fire is a symbol often used in these circumstances. And you think of the fire, the tongues of fire at Pentecost, for example, another one. But Moses' curiosity made him investigate. He was overcome by the awareness of being in the presence of a holy God. In this case, of course, the god of Midian. In a holy shiver, he showed respect and pulled off his shoes. These numinous experiences of holiness are always part of sacred history and very real to the person involved, often resulting in a change within him or herself. Do you remember Jacob and the change that came over him from the trickster to the clan leader of respect? Well, we nowadays are quite likely to call this change a revelation. And certainly on that holy mountain, Moses suddenly saw a connection between the god of Midian and the god of his own ancestors, who'd been shepherds like himself. He heard a voice within himself that suddenly made him aware that the god of Midian was no other than also the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as his mother had taught him when he was very young. And again, he hid his face, overcome by the experience. And what changed? From that time on, Moses felt convinced that the God of his ancestors were at Mount Sinai, Horeb, wanted him to bring all his fellow Hebrews away from Egypt, first to be reunited with him at Sinai, Horeb, and then to return them to Canaan, the land promised by their God to all Abraham's descendants. Well, Moses' first objection was one of his own ignorance. Who was this God that didn't have a name? Other gods had names like Nana of Ur, Ishtar, Babylon, or Ra, Mut, Isis, Osiris from Egypt. No one would believe him if he couldn't tell them the name of the God he was representing. And at last, a name was revealed. I am who I am. And we must pause now for a while in our story to contemplate this enigmatic name. Names don't usually spring out of nowhere, and this name was no exception. Its origins predate Moses and emerge as known to Midianites as Yo, or Yah, or even Yahoo, a name which has no particular meaning, but was just a vocal sound, probably provoked by the awesome splendour of the holy mountain. When a name is lengthened, however, more is understood about it, and the revelation to Moses enlarged Yah, or Yah, eventually into the Hebrew language as 4 letters. There they are, written in Hebrew. In our alphabet, it would read W, H, W, Y, R. But remember, Hebrew is written from right to left, so turn them round. And now we have Y, H, W, H. This is known as the 4-letter name, and its technical name, known to all sorts of people, is the Tetragrammaton. You say Tetragrammaton, and everybody knows it refers to these 4 Hebrew letters. Well, hundreds of years later on, Jews thought this divine name was much too special for their use in daily life, and even in the new synagogues of those days. They substituted it with the word Adonai, which means Lord. And the original sound of the 4-lettered words has since been completely forgotten. In medieval Europe, the Tetragrammaton was translated into German by Martin Luther, and it appeared as JHWH. Because there's no J, no Y, and no W in the German alphabet. J and V, though, however, were given the sounds to make them into a word as the name Jehovah. Now you're beginning to be familiar to you. That's because the J represents the Y, the original Y, and the V, the original W. Now this name Jehovah was used by many translators of the scriptures until the beginning of the 20th century, when the original YHWH was given 2 sort of huffy syllables and spoken as Yahweh, and translated into the English versions of the Old Testament as the Lord. But this time, the word Lord is always printed in capital letters. So when you get home and you open your Old Testaments, look at the word for the Lord, and you'll find it written in capital letters. Now we come back to the J and the E codes. I said, think of Jerusalem for the southern ones. I'm now going to give you the proper reason. Those codes have the code letter, the beginning of the god they're in the story. So whereas I said I remember the J code because it's near Jerusalem in the south, I should have told you I remember the J code because it's the Jehovah or the Yahweh code. And that story comes from the south of Israel. Whereas the one in the north, the E code, is E for the great god El. So we have the stories of El and the stories of Yahweh woven together in these early chapters of the Old Testament. Well, that's a brief summary. But do take the handout from the table before you go, entitled The Name of God, Names of God, and that will remind you of what I've just been talking about. Well, in enlarging its name, we have an enlarged meaning. It's still very enigmatic and mysterious, but its modern meaning is given as I am. And it's used to encompass the whole meaning of the verb to be in all its tenses, past, present, and future. And the author of the fourth gospel, that's the one that's different from the other three, uses this to good effect when describing the character of Jesus. I am the good shepherd. I am the bread of life, and so on. But now, let's get back to the story of Moses. The next slide, before we do that, I'll show you the next slide. There you are, the 4 Hebrew letters, writing from right to left, and then turned from left to right, translated into German as Jehovah, and now in English, Yahweh, or the Lord. But that's all on the handout for you. Well, Moses had hidden his face, so conscious of being in close contact with God. And as many people find, as the result of such an experience, he was faced with a challenge which would alter the whole course of his life in the future. Like many other people, for example, those challenged to offer themselves to be ordained, Moses tried to find all sorts of excuses why he couldn't do it, only to discover that God persists, God nags, and doesn't like taking no for an answer. Well, that was my experience, and possibly Tom's as well. Moses' first reaction was that no one would believe him, and the next, that he was not an eloquent speaker. Then he begged God to send someone else. And eventually God's patience ran out. Take your brother Aaron with you then, he was told. And Moses gave in. He first had to get permission from his father-in-law to leave. And then he hurriedly circumcised his son. Do you remember the clan mark? To prove that they were all part of Abraham's family. And at first, all was well. Moses met Aaron at Mount Sinai. And when back in Egypt, their people were enthusiastic to hear the good news. Moses' upbringing in the royal behaviour provided him with the means to meet the Pharaoh. He couldn't just knock at the door, any more than we can knock at the door of Buckingham Palace. But Moses was familiar with the etiquette. But it wasn't old Seti anymore. It was much more like his old classmate, Rameses II. Rameses, however, now Pharaoh, was unimpressed. Remember, in Egypt, he was now the living representative of all the gods. And his reply was, "I've never heard of this God Yahweh, and I certainly will not let any of my workmen go anywhere." Now remember, Rameses was very, very famous for all the building he did in his lifetime. And this picture of the temple at Karnak is one such example. That was built with stone, but remember, in the delta area of the Nile, all the building was done with bricks. Matters deteriorated when the angry Pharaoh ordered the Hebrew workers to go and gather their own straw for the bricks they made and still supply the same number. The Hebrews began to get angry with Moses. Oh, what a good story. Moses then complained to Yahweh, whose response was to promise that his will would prevail over all the Egyptian gods embodied in the Pharaoh. While he remembered Moses of his original experience at Mount Sinai, he had a great God behind him. Then Yahweh promised Moses that battle would commence between himself, via Moses, and all the Egyptian gods embodied in the Pharaoh. And in the first struggle, the fish in the river died, and the water turned to red. More next time. In the meantime, between now and a fortnight, assuming that you'll all want to tell me that there were 10 plagues in all, you may like the fun of reading about them in Exodus chapter 7 to 11, and making a list of them to the best of your ability. There'll be no marks for good work. You'll have some idea where we'll begin again next time, in 2 weeks, at 4:30, on the 21st of November. And thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Don't forget to take your notes and the piece of paper with all the names of God on before you go. And I put my old study Bible out again so you can see the weaving together of the J and the E codes. The bits in red came later as an editorial from the priests. Thank you for being here.